With that, I'm going to introduce Timoté Geimer. He's the CEO of Dualoop, a product management consultancy where he and his team support, advise, coach, train people and organizations on product management. Prior to that, he spent the last 12 years shaping and building product teams in startups and scale-ups, including Talent Square, Ilium, Now Jobs, and Achieved. Timoté is the author of How to Run Interviews During Product Discoveries, and you'll also find him engaged as a mentor in our Maker Mentor program, and in a lifelong learning process as a product person. Timoté once famously said that if he had $10 million, he'd invest that in part NFT and initiatives leveraging the metaverse and the rest of the European early stage tech scene. So we'll see if maybe his progress and thoughts on that side have changed at all since things have changed in the economy. But with that in mind, I'm going to pass over to Timoté to get things started, and we'll get going from there.
Thanks a lot, Scott, for this nice introduction. And yeah, spoiler, sorry, I've lost pretty much all my money because of my bad investments. But I'm back in track, and I'm trying to invest in smaller companies, more promising, more down to earth, probably. Qualitative research, I must say that's probably the more complex title I could ever thought about. So qualitative research is science behind the art of part of product discovery. So probably first question to ask is why it matter? Why are we talking about qualitative research and so boring words? Well, turns out it's mostly because even though product management sounds like a discipline, it's kind of more a blend of multiple sciences that are combined. And particularly when you talk about product discovery, it's ultimately about qualitative research and quantitative research being mixed. Why so? Because product management at its core is ultimately about having a population and a group of people that sharing some similarities and trying to understand them, understand eventually the problem and trying to solve it. It turns out that in the recent age, we're being urged by the market to solve problems through technology. That's what makes product management an essential piece of the whole value creation. So, but ultimately, why are we talking about discovery and why does that matter? I think this Dunning-Kruger effect sums it all, is really to go beyond that peak of Mount Stupid. I really like that that statement, and going toward that. You can all know that when you start speaking to someone in the street, they have always an opinion, but they don't know anything about that. And it turns out that when you start digging, you realize that you actually know nothing about a specific environment, and then you keep on progressing and learning and researching, and then you face at the moment where you start becoming eventually an expert in the field. And product discovery is all about that. It's going about something where you may have some assumption and leaving and going beyond those assumptions to actually go further and validate those assumptions so that you can make sure that you are better understanding your market and your population to resolve the problems. Of course, as I mentioned in the beginning, there is quantitative and qualitative research, and I decided to more focus on qualitative research rather than quantitative. And there is a simple explanation to that. But first, let's be clear: it's not one that is better than the other. It's just that one is easier to grasp, and sometimes, well, let's say that it usually makes sense to start by qualitative and then eventually go later to quantitative. And the main reason why quantitative is really difficult is because of the access to data. Product manager in general, and the earlier the company where you work is in the venture, the more difficult it is to access to enough data to move forward. Let's take a simple example. Your dad is an accountant. You really see him working every day. You're helping during the evenings, during holidays, to try to cope with the peak of demand. And from his customers are really frustrated because he's losing really legacy tools. And you spoke to a couple of eventually other accountants, and you feel that must be a trend. So you say, oh, I'll run the survey to really have a view on the market. And you start in Belgium because you're born there. So you look online and you realize there is around 3,800 accounting firms in Belgium. That's a true number, by the way. In average, it would be 3 accountants. So you would say, oh, great, I'll send a survey to all of them because thanks to the Chamber of Accountants, you can have access to all that list of people. So you send. But then the question is, how many response you should get to have something that is valuable and scientifically proved. But then if you do the math, you have 11,000 accountants, or 3 per firms. And let's say that you got really lucky. So you have a trust rates and you're sure that the people that would respond would be the right one. So you assume that only 1 per accounting firm would answer. You got really lucky with that. And then you have, of course, you have a bit of error margin because you don't know if whether this calculation would be right or not. You would need 372 respondents. Good luck with that. So that's mostly the challenge. So this is the reason why we usually focus first on qualitative research, because as we mentioned, it's faster, cheaper to process, more accessible. Well, cheaper is obviously a bit arguable, but in average, if you want to spend the same amount of time to get 20 interviews versus having 372 respondents, probably would be cheaper to do just 7 or 13 interviews. So the big word is epistemology of qualitative research. So where it comes from and what is the philosophy and genesis of qualitative research? Well, keep in mind that it's something that is not new. So even in the ancient Greek age, people were already reflecting on who they were, on the population, trying to understand and take conclusion, build up a hypothesis, and build civilization on that. But in around 1920, it's changed and it got formalized by key people like Weber, Durkheim, Marx. You may have heard of the Chicago School, who has massive influence on nowadays sociology approach and also economy. That's the genesis. That's where things got mostly formalized. Of course, it kept on evolving, the techniques evolved, but really the foundation of nowadays sociology and the qualitative approach is born there. There are what we would say 5 qualitative methods. Some would say that there are 7, but those 5 ones are the most obvious one. You have the ethnography. Ethnography is when you build a theory, when you embed yourself, in the daily life of the people. So you really go on the field. So typically that's also something that product manager used. For example, if you want to better understand how accountants would work, well, you may go in an accounting firm, just sit and eventually observe what's going on. So you can be an observer or you can do the job yourself. If you, well, for the accounting firm, you may introduce a bias. I will speak that later, but you can go, for example, and be a waiter or be a Uber driver for 1 or 2 to understand how they're struggling. Narrative, that's where you gather data from a few subjects, but you would follow them through a period of time. Then you have the phenomenology. That's where you retake an event and try to analyze the event through different angles. You would go, for example, when you want to analyze churn, phenomenology is an interesting approach because you really want to identify an event. When do people churn and why? So you start observing and collecting data from different sources to understand the churn. By screen recording, for example, or you may also attend customer success calls where people would call to shut down their accounts, or you may go and trying to meet those people to really understand why, what trigger, what happened before, what would happen next, so that you can better understand your churn behavior and eventually act on it. Then you have the grounded theory. That's the most important one, usually the one that everyone, for all product manager you'd use. It's the one where you build theory based on the data that you collect, and it's an iterative process. We'll go a bit deeper into that right after. And then you have the case study. So that's where you would gather in-depth information and detailed info on a specific subject. Could be about a company, could be for example, a case study would be to have a research firm that would analyze the trends on how people and what type of solution people use in a certain industry. Valuable information as well for product managers. So if we zoom in a bit more in the grounded theory, again, a bit of just a small definition is where you collect data and you analyze them simultaneously. It's really a process. Remember, you think about those 2 logos and the loop. So what do? You go, you process data, you analyze, and eventually you go back, you refine your theory, and then you move on. Your data are coded and categorized. The coding in social science, really the process of going through the data and then taking piece of the text, putting a label on that, and gathering those labels. So, for example, you go into the transcript of an interview, and you say, "Hey, here the person is talking about his emotion, and that's a negative emotion, or that's a positive emotion." Or then you go and say, "Oh, but this is positive emotion about the way he has to fill paperwork, because paperwork become a matter, and then you eventually a problem that you want to validate or invalidate." And then you would also integrate the literature. So, and all different type of findings that you would have, you blend that. So you ground it together to refute or eventually confirm your hypothesis. There are three main methods for collecting data in grounded theory. You would have the interviews, the focus group, and the observation. On the interview, they could be open, semi-structured, or structured. Muted. So usually, what you would do with the interview, you would have open, semi-structured, or structured, as I mentioned. Open is when you start, but you really want to explore something. You really know nothing about something. You would go and start talking with someone, might be an expert, and you see where it leads. Semi-structured interview is more when is the most commonly used one. Is when you have already some hypotheses that you want to invalidate, and you will build an interview kit, and you go toward getting those findings. The structured one is something that you would avoid because it's introduced way too much bias and it's really difficult to control. Focus group is really interesting when you want to see dynamics and group dynamics. It's useful to explore or leverage collective memories, for example. So think about things that are more event-based. So you want to interview some waiters or people in a restaurant, work in a restaurant, and you want to leverage their memories or certain event that happened to them. And then you would put them all in a room, and you would leverage this collective intelligence to surface some events that people might not think about or remember immediately. But it's really difficult because you are inducing bias. So one person could lead a group, could influence some things. So it's difficult to really discuss afterward. Observation is the one that we already discussed about. Remember, it could be, you could go either incognito, so you would people would not know that you're observing them, or either you would express that you are that you are actually observing them, and the observation could be also active or passive. Nowadays, observation is a key technique used by product managers by using a solution like full story, microscalarity. So would have screen recording. You really observe what people are doing with your software. So some key principles: research, qualitative research is an empirical and iterative process. So you go back through what I mentioned as a loop. You go and based on your past experience and based on your learning, you will refine your research and you will adapt. And then you may eventually revert to your hypotheses, change them, and then move forward and revalidate and so on and so forth. So it's really an iterative process, which is going to be actually infinite. It's a probabilistic approach. Keep that really in mind. So it's not about proving that you're right. It's actually trying to do everything you can to prove that you're wrong. And ultimately, if you can't prove that you're wrong, then maybe you're right. And then I say this is probabilistic approach, but with non-probabilistic sampling. So the sampling is the process of selecting the people that you would interview. It's non-probabilistic because the likelihood that a person got selected, it's kind of unknown, and you really don't know how, and you can't say that this sample is really representative from your population, because you would do only 7 or 13 interviews, whereas if you would be in quantitative research, you would need a much more higher volume to make sure that your sample is representative. It's not the goal of this type of research, but it doesn't mean that it's not scientific. So there is an approach, there is a purpose, and there is different method to select people. It could be purposive. You can use the snowball principle, quota, or convenience. Purposive, for example, is when you start selecting people with a specific intent. So you would say that there is different type of population or different artifacts, you would have built already some hypothesis, and then you would select your sample and the T people based on your first hypothesis. Snowball is when you start with one person, you ask that person to refer others. And then you go from one person to find others and so on and so on. The quota is when you would say, I want to have X people interviewed with from companies under 300 FTEs, and then X person with companies between 200 and 500 and so on. That would be quota. And then the convenience is when you shoot out and say, hey, I'm doing an interview, who wants to be interviewed? And you wait for people to come to you. Of course, all of them must be discussed at some point because you may induce certain bias that you will have to discuss or recharge. When we talk about semi-guided interviews, and actually that's even true for observation and also for the other types of method of research. We're talking about saturation principles, the moment where doing an additional data collection doesn't bring any additional information or variation of information. And it's not only true for semi-guided interviews, it's also true for observation. You don't do only one observation, you will do multiple observation. And when by doing the third or the fourth observation, you realize that you're not learning anything else, anything new, substantially, then you would say that, okay, you've learned everything you could by doing this type of research and this type of observation. You see on the more stupid graph, I added a couple of numbers that's usually for semi-guided interviews. I'll be honest with you, there is a lot of different theories and a lot of different research on that. Some people would say that you would need 100 to really be full. Some would say that you need 5, 7, 6. That really depends on the preciseness of your topic of research and the hypothesis that you want to validate or invalidate, which would define your interview kit, and your interview kit would ultimately define how fast you'll reach the saturation process. So usually, if you have an interview well structured, you have a good interview kit that leads to a 1 hour and a half interview session, you will need 7 to 13 interviewed with one type of profile to reach that saturation process. Be careful when you use a method such as quotas or such as purposive research. So you purposive sampling, then each purpose type or each quota would require the same amount of people. So you may need when you do your saturation, you may need to interview 7 people in the first quota, 13 person to the second quota to reach that saturation, because some might bring you more information than other, but you still want to make sure that you got all the things that you could collect based on their profile. And the triangulation, that's a really important one. It is usually neglected. It's about crossing and looking at your research from different angles. So you could use, and it goes to mixing different theories, different methods, and different data source, or even researcher. So it's not only about, so let's say that when you start doing a research, you would do some observation is one method, but you would also mix quantitative and qualitative data, or you would mix quantitative data in 2 different qualitative types, so observation, narrative, and eventually semi-guided interviews. So I put there one example. Let's say that you have a product that is running and you are trying to improve or go or explore the opportunity to expand or go beyond, insert or develop a certain feature for your product. One source could be the user feedback via the customer success team or in the tools. The second would be the observation of the existing application through a full story clarity. And the third one would be semi-guided interviews, for example. There are 3 different data sources and methods that you can cross to improve, let's say, the chance that your research would be valuable. Reflexivity. It's kind of going beyond yourself and understand that you're a human being that have an ego, that have a past, that have a set of experience that may influence your research. So it's an essential part of our research is being able to question and to challenge your observation, your data, and your research, to discuss eventually the bias that could be introduced or things that could have gone wrong, or the different bias of interpretation that you would bring. Speaking about bias, we usually split some group bias in 5 categories: the design, selection, the data collection, analysis, and the publication. The design one is when you start defining how you will approach your research. So typically, what we just said, saying, hey, we'll do a research based on what we want to search. We'll go for qualitative research and we do X, Y, Z. So that can be wrong from the beginning. So you auto induce bias. Then it would be the selection. So typically the sampling selection, where you will introduce bias, as we mentioned. If you start doing, especially when you start using a snowball effect or I can't remember the last one now, but anyway, if you do the snowball one, for example, or the random and just collect people will come, you bring a bias, because with the snowball, if you have one person, it will only introduce you to other people they didn't know, so they are biased because they are small. They may be a small group of people that would be like-minded. Same goes if you shoot out and wait for people to come. There is a bias because there are some people that are naturally interested eventually by the topic that we bring, but might not be representative of the crowd. Typically, startups from early stage do that mistake. So they would go into a small group of people. They are biased because they are experts, so they think that everyone is thinking like them. They would talk to another expert or a handful of 5 experts that are really the forward thinker in an industry. And then they realize, and then they would come with the argument saying, hey, we're too soon on the market. We're 5 years too early with our solution. No, it's wrong. It's just that it got wrong from the beginning and just talked to people that were not representative from their audience. The analysis is when you start discussing things, and you may introduce bias in your analysis because you may want to introduce or push toward your concept and discarding some information that would invalidate your theories. And the publication, in the case of a product matter, is when you actually don't use your research, or where you start documenting your research. You may have done your work so great and you want to have a 20-page analysis that says everything and everything's right. But then you store that in a Notion, hidden Notion, or collection in a Confluence page, and no one is reading it. So that's a publication bias, because ultimately no one will read it, so no one will use it, so it's useless. So when we look at some common bias, when we talk about the data collection, the question that's here, I do a small zoom just to be precise on the interview, because as we said, it's usually the most used technique. So the semi-guided interviews, the number 1 bias is the question order. So by the order of your question, you are introducing a bias. Because if your first question determined or is too detailed, you can't explore the rest. So let's say that you want to validate, for example, the use of a bicycle. So you want to commuting habit, and your question is would you be able to influence some people by better or more using their bike? If you ask them directly and say, hey, are you a pro biking cycler? Then you can't ask them afterwards how often they would use or how attentive they would use to cycle with their bike, because you're inducing a bias, because they will start thinking toward pro cycling, and then everything that you would ask afterward would be biased. It's better than you start asking, say, how do you usually commute? Or say, have you already considered using your bike? Oh, and then eventually then they will say, oh, but I'm actually a pro cycling, so pro cycler, blah, blah, blah. And then you would loop back, so you can you know that this would be a bias or something specific about that person, then that you can afterwards discuss for the whole interview. Leading question is usually when you push or drive the person towards a certain direction by the question that you would ask. For the small anecdote, I had a very exciting. So I was coaching someone doing qualitative research. So we were running some interviews. So I would do the first interview, and then it would be him to do it. Every single time that he was asking question, he was first asking correctly the question, and then he felt obliged, or I don't know why, he was elaborating toward the question, giving example of what could be the answer. But that is naturally introducing bias, because then person would pick between the different options. Or just by those, so the person next to you might just try to follow your logic and pick the option that you mentioned that is most likely to satisfy you. Whereas you must be careful in the way you structure your question, so that you don't induce a certain direction toward an answer, being neutral as possible, as much as possible. Which links to the bias of confirmation. Huh? So it's when people try to interpret the data to support their hypothesis. And also the social desirability or acceptability. Desirability is when people, when you start if you introduce your subject research and what are you're trying to find, then people want to be nice with you, so they will try to give the answer aligned with your theory. So that's something you must also be really careful about. It's what usually I would recommend when you do a semi-guided interview, to never mention what is your research topic about, or vaguely the topic, but not what you try to, not your research question, and not the hypothesis that you're trying to invalidate. That's something that would stay confidential. You may say that you would explain more in details at the end of the interview what you're trying to search, but not before. The last one, the acquiescence of friendliness. Let's say that if you're a bad interviewer, people are running out of time, they may be tempted to just say yes, just to confirm whatever you would bring with to reach the end of the interview. If you see that happening, probably it's easier to close the interview rather than continue and having every screw data. The sponsor one is an interesting one. That's usually the one that you must be careful about when you work with customers, because customers might, especially if they love your product, they would be tempted to shine or to build a connection with you. So they would be tempted to answer in certain way to leverage a relationship with you. So of course, that's a lot of theory, a lot of things, and you say, well, okay, but that doesn't tell me how to do research. It doesn't tell me much about, it seems like a really complex thing, but actually it's not that complex. It's just some principles to keep in mind, and you'll see that it's a natural flow. So what I tried here in this section is to really give you some steps to follow and a few things to be attentive to. The first one is the one that usually is a bit overlooked, but cause a lot of trouble if it's not done correctly, is the problem framing. So the problem definition. What are you trying to solve? What's the problem that you want to dig deeper in, and what it is not? So you may have a topic, and that's usually the problem. So the topic think that is getting too vague. They don't build their research questions, so it's difficult afterward to really validate or invalidate things. Whereas you should really have a research question and then a hypothesis that you would try to invalidate your research. And if you can't invalidate them, then maybe they're right. Let's take back our accounting app example. If we try to apply that logic, we would say that the topic is the effectiveness of contemporary accounting experts' software equipment. And the research question is, can be, let's say, what is the impact of the contemporary softwares on the accountant's ability to effectively serve their customers? So you see here, I'm not talking about legacy software. I'm just saying, what would be the impact if we bring something new on the market? And then I would build a hypothesis to validate or invalidate. I would say that accountants are struggling to collect people's information. They have difficulties to highlight the time spent on customer requests, and accountant would spend too much time on easy to automate tasks. And then all my research would be related to those three hypotheses and trying to invalidate them. If I can't invalidate them, then maybe could be the foundation to build a new software. So the method and the sampling, the selection, let's remember how to build a sample. It's really about selecting the right methods and the research based on the population. So you really have to think about what is my population, how easy it is to access to it, what is the scope of my investigation, and based on that, I will define my sampling process. I'll give you a concrete example. When I was working at Helium, one of our target audience were consulting firms. And we had quite some really big names in the consulting, and we wanted to dig deeper into that to validate that our existing customers were in line with the market, trying to make sure that we were not really serving the only few forward-thinking ones, or they were a really special breed. We wanted to make sure that we're representative from the rest of the market. So we wanted to go beyond our existing or natural market. So we tried to reach out to people, and it turns out that we couldn't. People were not responding because we ignore one thing, that knowledge management is really at the heart of any consulting firm. So they don't want to talk about their internal way of working, the way they structure and collect information, the way they share them. So we had to use that snowball effect solution to go there, to go from one person, a consulting firm, trying to see if they would have changed from a consulting firm to another, and ask them to refer us to someone that would eventually accept to interview. And we really struggled there. And it turns out that we were not able to reach that saturation process before running out of people to interview. And if you remember about the key principle of our research, is really about being actually feasible. And in this case, using interviews to collect data about consulting firm was actually not feasible. So we had to review and use different techniques such as use cases, narrative to confirm and invalidate our hypothesis. So if we take again our accounting app example, this could be a typical way of approaching that. We would use the grounded theory and the case study. From grounded theory, we'll go into view 7 to 13 accountants eventually. And we would also use observation. We'll spend half a day into different accounting firms, really see from the inside the way they work, what they struggle, where they are complaining and talking to each other about difficult case, or where they would be frustrated about the customer, seeing customer coming in and out, the reason why, and so on and so forth. And then we will leverage also case study to eventually have a broader view on the market and approaching the software market for accountants and getting a better view on it. So now, a bit more details on the interview kit. It's an important step. It's about typically this is also one of the key things that I see people and product managers failing at, because they think that semi-guided interview is just about talking to people, and then they just go with a broad idea of what they would like to discuss, and they speak to a lot of people, but in an unstructured way. But it turns out that if you're in a unstructured way, good luck to collect valid information, being to cross information from the different interviews to reach eventually that saturation point or validate your research. You must have an interview kit that would connect to your hypothesis and making sure that you have different way to validate your hypothesis. But of course, it's not a closed interview. It's not about having a set of questions, re-asking them next to that. It's more topics to address during an interview, so that you make sure that you cover all the area that you wanted to cover. So if we look at the key artifacts of an interview kit, it must be flexible. So it's a conversation opener thing. It's not a list of questions to follow. It must be adaptive. So you would use theme versus specific questions. It's open, so you avoid closed question. You use questions that open the conversation, and you follow the logical order. That's something we already mentioned. what I would recommend you is to build a boilerplate, because what you realize that there are a set of questions that you would always ask. So typically you would observe by understanding your style and your way of approaching things, that you would have opening questions that would help people to be at ease, that would work, so that doesn't work, so you would be good for you to remember them, so you can always use them. So you would have also some icebreaker questions or some techniques that you want to remember because you realize that they work well to do a transition between the different topics, or techniques to bring back the person into your frame of interview if eventually they diverge towards the topics that are not interesting to you. Keep in mind that an interview is meant to identify things that you know that you don't know, but also things that you don't know that you don't know, what you call the black swans. So you have your frame of research. What you want is to really uncover everything in that frame, but eventually also uncover things that are next to that, because your frame might be wrong. So you may look in this area and you realize that actually your area is like this. That's something you want to uncover during your qualitative research. That's what it's meant for. When you do quantitative research, you really stay in the frame. So you really go narrower and deeper in certain area rather than expanding your area of research. When you talk about running interview, I'll skip a bit there because I already mentioned a couple of things, but keep in mind that you must act as an active listener. It's not about you talking, it's about the person in front of you to speak. So you should not speak more than 20% of the time, and that's already a lot. What is important for you to keep in mind, because quite often I hear the question, how long should be an interview? The truth is that you can have 3 hours interview that are super deep and super valuable, while you can have an interview that after 20 minutes, you can't get anything else or anything more from the person in front of you. And most of the time, you're the one responsible for that. Why? Simply by being able to follow the interviewee logic and not yours. So you must here take a bit of reverse engineering of how the brain and the memory work. So you would have that working memory, things that are really top of mind of someone, and then you will have the long-term memory. So everything that is in your working memory is something that is easy to access. As long as you stay in the working memory, people are not really tired, they don't have that interview fatigue. So, but the way your brain is working is like, for the one that are a bit older, it's like the hard drive memory and the kernel memory, for example. If you take the two extreme, the kernel memory or the RAM would have some probabilistic techniques to load and preload information so that you don't feel that it's getting slow. The brain works the same way. So you have things in your working memory, and then when you start addressing certain parts, certain things that are in the working memory, your brain would go and collect information and load more information related to that. As long as you use that technique, you can go from one event in the memory to another one, to another one, to another one, and you stay in the working memory. As long as you do that, you will keep the person really active and entertained, and you can really go deep and collect a lot of information. We'd say this would be a rich interview. But if you go from working memory and you start jumping to one topic that is too far from the other and so on and so forth, after 10, 15, 20 minutes, the person will be just exhausted because they will have to go all over the place. They will say, oh, that's too far. Oh, I don't remember that. Or yeah, no, maybe, but not sure. And then you're screwed. So that's something you really have to observe the first minute of the interview to see the way the person think, what are the things that are top of mind, how did they react positively to something or negatively. So emotion are essential to that, and then trying to navigate over that. So your interview kit is not the ordered list of things, it's topics. So you would try to go into the topics that makes the most sense, then let's diverge and then jump to another topic and so on, as long as things stay fluid and logic. While of course being aware of the eventual bias that you would introduce. If you want to go a bit deeper into that, as Scott mentioned, out of the really small guide about how to run interviews, a lot of practical things. You can get in. I think that Scott at the end will mention that we'll be happy to give away a couple of them to you afterward. Here, of course, you would have done your interviews, you would gather different research from different places, and then you have to document them and discuss them. I won't go too long into that, but keep in mind that it's not about just leveraging your memory. It's about transcribing things in data and then structuring that, doing a deep analysis into it so that you can go back toward that and also leverage those information into another context, because an interview would have covered a lot of topic, and eventually in the future, you may want to address something that is slightly related, and you want to leverage all the data that you already collected to your new research. That one is one also a lot of people kind of fail, is making things actionable. If you write a 20-page paper, it might be really complete, super detailed, but no one will read it, especially if you lost somewhere. You really have to take those information and put them into context. So create your product information document, link your data, your research toward justifying certain of the action. You want eventually to do to link systematically your key initiative to the research and the future research. You want to refer to your research quite often in different contexts internally, and also translate your research and your findings into actionable piece for your peers and your colleague of different departments. One way to communicate, and of course, I would really say you never communicate enough. One way of communicating is eventually to use Therese technique of the interview snapshot. It's a small grid to highlight a few things that we want to remember from an interview. That would help your colleagues to not go into your full research and just collect a few snackable things. Putting data into motion is something that I would really insist on. When you do research, it's not only for you as a product manager, it's for your organization. And keep in mind that all what you collect is valuable for your go-to-market strategy, for your customer success initiative. So when you identify some findings, share them, explain to others how useful it can be for in a certain context. When you interview existing customers, they will share things on the way that you use eventually your software, which are really valuable things for your marketing department or product marketing. Do not neglect that. So I have a couple of pitfalls to highlight. I'll try to go fast on that because I kind of highlight a lot of them during the presentation. I really want to make sure also that we have a bit of time for eventually some questions. So I see some questions already popping up. What I would suggest to gain some time. So while I go toward the pitfalls, do not hesitate to already share your question in the Q&A so that afterwards Scott and I can really quickly react and answer to them. Falling in love with your products or your ideas, of course, you know that one. You go deep into something, you start doing research, and you start feeling excited because you think about the solution, and then you realize that you must do a bit of research. So you start doing your research, but you are inducing so much that bias that you're screwing your research. So typically by badly structuring your hypothesis, badly structuring your interview kit, or inducing answers to your interview, your interviewee. To avoid that, it's always useful to get your peers challenging your thoughts or challenging your way of approaching that. So leverage the people that are against you or against your idea, and help ask them to review your interview kit. Because your goal is really to have different perspective on something and not bringing too big bias. Mixing topics and lack of focus, typical one. If you don't know what you're searching, do not expect to find it. Simple as that. Spending too much or too little time in discovery. Of course, that one is really difficult to master. So from one end, you have the CEO technique. So the CEO knows, so do we. So why would we do some research? So we quickly jump and do 1 or 2 interviews, stay at the most stupid thing, and then you just jump because we believe that we know everything. Or the opposite is more when you have something, you start doing a discovery, but your scope is so broad that you don't want to accept it, and you start doing some research and you don't know where you go, and ultimately you stay stuck in that situation just because you should really re-challenge your frame and the why and the what you're trying to solve, because most of the time it's just because it's not well defined or it's not commonly accepted towards your team, and that causes troubles afterwards. Involving too many people is also an interesting one. Won't go too deep on, but naturally, the more people involved in your research, the slower it gets. So it's better to have a small team of researchers going fast rather than trying to involve having too many gateways. So typically involving too much your CS team to eventually reach out to your customer. Go directly toward your customers. Don't try to have intimidated people. That will go much faster. Taking shortcuts, already mentioned. Forgetting to close the feedback loop. Typically, you do research, but you are bringing bias naturally into your interpretation. So it's always good once you are doing interpretation, you start having your summary of your research to confront your findings with the people that you have interviewed eventually, because that will help you to fine grade or invalidate certain theories or certain interpretations. Not communicating enough. Very simple. You never, ever communicate enough. So at every single step, every time that you have interview something interesting, take just something snackable, a quote, or just sharing something exciting or anything. Just share it, or announce the amount of people that you will interview, name them, or put some quotes somewhere, a wall of fame, or just a wall somewhere where you would have all the amount of the people that you interview, the interview snapshot printed on something, whatever you do, but communicate. Some key takeaways to close on that. I would really insist on the fact that you must be systematic. So it's not something, the process should remain the same. So, and the reason why the process and the systematism is important is for leveraging, to leverage the empirical aspect of things. So it's by doing things and repeating them that you can learn and improve. If you are changing your process, or if you are doing random things all the time, then you can't learn from the past. Well, and then you don't progress. The related things to that is applying duck footing all the time. So apply product management to yourself. So when you do something, product management is about solving a problem. So always question yourself. Are you still aware, still conscious of the problem you're trying to solve? Or is this getting fuzzy? Then go back on your desk and re-clarify that. Be always conscious of the bias that you are bringing. And the key one is yourself. So be aware of who you are and challenge your emotion and your perceptions on things, because it's not about you. You're just someone, and you're not the people that you're trying to solve. You're not representative of your audience. Your customers are your customers. The market's the market. You're not the market. Keep that in mind. It's really important. Keep on learning and go beyond product management literature. I love Marty Kagan, Teresa Torres, and others, but your level of the art thought leader. Teresa Torres, I would say that it's the closest from really technique and being a bit more scientifically valid. But Marty Kagan and others are great to inspire you, and his first book is really about that. But you must go toward the techniques that are beyond. So go into qualitative and quantitative research books and learn from that, because that's the foundation of what you will do. And if you just leverage on your peer and asking them how they do research and what are the tips, then you're just screwing yourself and you're not developing yourself. Take a book, take a sociology book and quantitative research one, read it through so you can look on your what chapter, but you'll learn things and then you'll do a better job. And communicate. Voilà. Thanks everyone. Scott, I think it's the time when I hand the voice over to you.
All right, let's jump into the Q&A. First one here is, are focus groups still used in modern software product management? I know you mentioned that as one of the techniques as part of the earlier set of slides that you had there.
Yeah, it's difficult, but it's really useful. I'll give you an example. When I was working now jobs, we were trying to have an end-to-end solution for the interim market. So we're working with a lot of workers that would have to go, and they would have to do a check-in, check-out sometime manually or not. And there are a lot of things that can happen, them being late, or and you will start building a lot too much assumption on how it would work. And you don't want to only use one interview or another, because by the time you would interview the person that would have done the job, it would be too far into in his memory. So when you want to use the leverage that collective memory and the souvenir, think about the family thing. When you have a family gathering, they start thinking about the memory of when you were a child, and if you're interviewing them individually, they don't remember much. But once when you remind another one, and then another one, and then they start popping up, and that's what you want, and that's what you want with focus group. So yes, still useful.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I see a lot of definitely focus groups too in the context of like cabs, like customer advisory boards and other kinds of situations too, where they're utilized to expand essentially the range of inputs. I mean, the challenge there, as you mentioned, is maintaining essentially some integrity between each people, so they're not feeding off each other, and finding the right kind of insights from that.
Exactly. So it's good for emotions, so leveraging that, but don't try to think when you see that one answer could influence another one, then you screwed with focus groups.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. What do you see as the range of industry standards around sort of interviewee compensation, or even the whole concept of interviewee compensation?
I think we should build some theories and research about that. So that one is really difficult to answer. I think I don't even know that there are some industry standard. I would recommend to not pay people if that's possible, because you are inducing a bias, but sometimes it's necessary to get some people engaged. I really don't know. I can't answer that.
Yeah, I think some of the patterns I've seen have been like $1 a minute kind of equivalents. So sometimes it's like a half an hour of your time is that $25 Amazon gift card or whatever it might be. And I know people certainly, try to avoid that bias side as much as possible when doing interviews. Try to get the intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators going. How do you best capitalize on prototyping combined with the discovery interviews without invoking bias or minimizing it?
It really depends where you are. So it's about how you build your research method. So you go from not knowing anything, and then you're in the first quadrant of framing your problem. Then you don't use the prototyping because it's too early. It's only when you're sure that you will well define your problem, then you start inducing a solution. If you do go too early with that, you're screwing everything, because you are inducing a bias when people would just try to follow your logic.
Mm-hmm.
It's when you're sure about your assumptions and the problems, the hypotheses, then you start showing eventually a solution. But then be careful, because I would challenge and invite you to first validate some early flow charts only, and then when your flow chart are validated, then eventually a low fidelity wireframe. Because if you miss a step, people will try to compensate them for your logic, and you may miss a lot of valuable information.
Yeah, that's great context. If during interviews you discover things you didn't know, so that essentially means maybe you have new questions that you need to ask. Do you need to update your interview guide? I think part of this, I think you covered a little bit in the sense of keeping your interview guide pretty open-ended, with lots of room to adapt, and the adaptability being important. Maybe you can chat a little bit about that.
Exactly. And that's what you call the black swans. So the things that you don't know, that you don't know. Of course, when you are in the grounded theory, it's an iterative process, remember? So you go and you uncover something that may validate or invalidate your hypothesis. So yes, review your interview kit to integrate those new findings with the new ones.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Thoughts on outcome-driven innovation? That's Tony Elwick's approach with Job to Be Done. And that's a pretty big answer, probably.
So the job to be done is an interesting thing. So outcome driven, but again, I think about your research and what you want to validate. So it's based on your hypothesis. A job to be done is eventually an hypothesis of something that you want to validate, and then do your interview accordingly. The danger is that you are building strong assumption with job to be done. So I would rather refer to that as more the second part, where you when you have already framed your problem and then you validate the solution, rather than be backward and earlier, because you are really inducing strong assumption that can drive bias.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thoughts on sort of form, tools, ways in which you sort of collect the data from your interviews and how you go about the analysis. I imagine you're like me, you got maybe a history of the giant wall behind you full of sticky notes and some of those other kinds of, maybe people are looking for different techniques or different approaches.
Yeah, I'm a bit old-fashioned style with that. So just a zoom in a record in the transcription, or eventually a voice recorder when you meet people somewhere, eventually taking some photo. And usually I would just have a notebook writing few things after the interview, not during the interview. We avoid that. I would recommend more bringing someone with you that would be an observer and taking notes eventually, and then discussing afterwards. Because one thing that is important is also the emotion. And the people reacting. So it's nice to have another person that would observe, because then you would have two ways of collecting the data: the voice and also the attitude. And that's something interesting. And right after the interview, when you're still fresh in your memory, that you would discuss those things and you would mention them.
Yeah, that's great.
And afterward, you have plenty of tools, of course.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot out there that can help speed some of that up from an analysis perspective. I mean, Productboard, as an example, in our case, really helps you, do some of that analysis, understand some of those themes and patterns, understand some of the sentiment and the data that's in there. And there's definitely lots of other options out there as well on that side. Well, that's great. I'm going to be really mindful of time. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all the questions today, but we'll try to wrap things up. Thanks again, Timoté. I think that was a really interesting session. I think people got a lot out of it and learned a lot. And I really, really appreciate your time on this. Just to remind everybody, we did share in the chat our post-event survey. We'd love to get your thoughts and feedback on this side. Again, really, really helpful for both Timoté and for us, making sure that our events are great and improving. So feel free to take some time on that side. For those of you that we didn't get to your questions, feel free to pop them in a conversation in our community. Timoté is in there. He's available, and we can certainly get him to answer and share his ideas and thoughts, or you can post them on our recap afterwards when it's available. We've got a great bunch of events coming up, including our Product Makers Summit happening on the 21st, with a fantastic lineup of speakers on that side, and lots of regular ongoing community events happening every week here in the community. Encourage you to check them out and continue your learning journey, essentially as a product manager or product leader, with some of these different people and experts that are sharing their thoughts. And if you want to get involved as a speaker, please do let us know. We'd love to hear from you. You can find details out essentially on our community on that side. And with that, we'll wrap up and say thank you very much. I will draw for a couple copies of Timoté's book, as I mentioned, from those that attended today, and we'll reach out to you directly over email, as well as make a note of that inside the recap topic. Take care.
Everyone, thank you. Take care.